Hello, I'd like to speak to you today on how to prepare essay questions for Philosophy 1. By now, you've seen the exam questions. And I have, in addition, some good news as well as the bad news you've already seen. But first, let me ask you a question. Is the simple easier than the complex? That may seem to have an obvious answer, but maybe not. Imagine that you're up at Oxford. Now, American students would find this difficult because the system is very different than we're used to. There are, for example, no courses. One doesn't sign up for Philosophy 1, Anthropology 101, whatever. So there are no midterms, there are no finals, there are no exams whatsoever. What happens is one goes up for 3 years. Our American degrees take 4, theirs take 3. And during those 3 years, you, the student, are responsible for getting an education and getting prepared to pass that one last final exam. There are all kinds of resources up at Oxford. There are lectures, professors usually reading a chapter of their latest book, so it's rather a different lecture format than we're used to, but not lectures required in a course as we're used to. Libraries, of course, all kinds of interesting people with whom to talk. But basically, you have 3 years to get it together and get ready. And how one uses those 3 years is up to the student. Charles Darwin, for example, he was up at Cambridge, the university, took off an entire year, basically. Just went shooting with his dogs, went hunting. But he got it together. In the end, he passed his exams, he got his degree, and as we know, went on to become Charles Darwin. In any case, however you do it, at the end of 3 years, you sit the last big exam, the one big exam. It's called schools. And there are 3 options. You can pass, you can fail, or you can pass with honors. Now, students are set essay questions. These questions can be very simple. But let me suggest they are deceptively simple. Here are some examples of questions one might be asked at Oxford for a degree. Who was Socrates? Is my hearing a noise in my head as mechanical as the passing of a noise through a telephone? If I know that Y is the case, is it possible for me not to know that I know it? Could there be nothing between 2 stars? One sentence questions. What could be simpler? Take the first one. Who was Socrates? Okay, one could say, Socrates was an old man wearing a dirty sheet who drank an herbal drink. This is not false. But at the same time, it seems to me this would be a little bit too abbreviated to pass with honors, even much less to pass. This is a complex question. It seems simple, but you've got to think, okay, what's the difference between Socrates' views and Plato's views? We know about Socrates primarily through Plato, also Xenophon, never wrote anything in his own right. So it's kind of like the problem of the Gospels. We know about Jesus because the 4 Gospels that made the cut say some things about him, and some of the others that didn't make the cut also do. But was there a real historical Jesus? Was there a real historical Socrates? These are the sorts of questions that you have to have been, you have to work through, you have to be prepared for when you're confronted with that simple question, who was Socrates? All that stuff is implied and it's not stated. And likewise for the other questions, is hearing a noise in my head as mechanical as the passing of a noise through a telephone? So you've got to be acquainted with Berkeley, for example, and whether to what extent things exist outside of our perception. What's the difference between listening and hearing? What's the difference between, if any, between a noise and a sound? If a tree falls in the forest, does anyone hear it? If no one's around, is there a sound? Perhaps that involves a category mistake, and if so, that's something to point out. If I know that Y is the case, is it possible for me not to know that I know it? Okay, this is a review for you guys. Justified true belief. Is that what we mean by knowledge? Or do we mean something fuzzier by knowledge? Tacit knowledge, for example. Is Michael Polanyi right when he says, we know more than we can tell? That is, that our knowledge doesn't just consist in articulate propositions which we can defend, but it consists in some other things as well. Could there be nothing between 2 stars? Well, again, this is a review for you guys. Takes one back to Heraclitus and Parmenides. Is it even possible to step in the same river once? Is there any such thing as individuality? Is there even space between persons, existential space, much less physical space between the stars, and so on and so forth? So these questions are rather complicated, and they do ultimately require complicated answers for the most part. As with any rule, there will always be exceptions. Here's a famous exception. Once at Oxford, a question was asked, "Is this a question?" And one student responded in one sentence, and it went, "Yes, if this is an answer." He passed with honors. In the rare case called the congratulatory first, professors don't even query the candidate, but they stand up and applaud. This happened to Bernard Williams up at Balliol. This happened to Martin Amis, the novelist, up at Exeter. It's kind of rare, but it can happen. However, for the most part, even a seemingly simple question needs a complicated answer. So just because the form of the question is simple doesn't mean that it's a walk. Now, your questions are not simple like the Oxford questions. Your questions are complex. Here they are for the midterm. Now, I suggest that you cope with the complexity in these questions in 2 steps. Step 1, break it down, okay? Some philosophers think that the goal of our knowledge should be nothing less than certainty. Here's one of the sample questions. Others say it is something more modest, such as error reduction, and usually they mean also that certainty is either an impossible or an unworthy goal. So discuss Plato and Descartes on certainty, discuss Socrates and Popper on error reduction. How is this issue related to the distinction between analytic and synthetic propositions? So you can see from this question, there is some lead-in material, some sheer rhetoric. Prune that out from the beginning. And of course, you don't have to state that. You certainly don't have to restate the question to answer it. Some students do that. Don't. It's just a waste of time. Cut to the chase scene. And here the chase scene is. There are some tasks, point by point. I've isolated them this way as A through F. The question asks that Plato be discussed and Descartes be discussed on the problem of certainty, that Socrates be discussed and Popper be discussed on the question of error reduction, and then that be related to a further distinction between analytic and synthetic propositions. So of course you have to state what you understand those to be and then draw a relationship. So at least 6 different tasks. One could break it down perhaps if one wished even further. But basically a complex question like this can be broken down into, say, 6 specific tasks. That's step 1, break it down. Step 2 is then tackle those one by one. Assign yourself the job of responding to all specific tasks given in the question one by one. And you could even make a checklist, and make sure that you check them off, A, B, C, D, E, and F. The hallmark of a good essay is that it will respond to each and every one of the component bits, A through F in this case. Above all, the beginning of wisdom is to respond to the question asked. This may sound like a no-brainer, but some people go off on another question entirely. You could write a great essay on Schopenhauer. You could write a professional grade essay on Schopenhauer that might be worthy of publication in a philosophy journal. But for the purposes of an exam question on rationalism and empiricism, that's just non-responsive, and an answer needs to be responsive. Okay. Question often comes up, how long should essays be? Well, let me clue you in. Has anybody ever heard of the staircase method? Perhaps some of my colleagues use this, I don't know. The staircase method basically consists of standing at the top of the staircase, throwing the papers down. The heaviest ones land toward the bottom, they get the A's. The lighter ones land toward the top, they get the F's. I don't do this. I actually read your essays. So write them to be read, not write them for the weight of the ink. How long? A single paragraph is not an essay. Obviously, if one has a complex question like this one, multiple parts, there are going to be multiple paragraphs. On the other hand, 5 to 10 pages might be too long. That would be good for a term paper or research paper, but that's not what the assignment here is. I don't want to specify, so many pages. I don't want to specify so many words, just because I know from experience that some people can say the same thing more concisely than other people can say at great length. This applies to languages as well. In my day job, I used to edit a joint Spanish-English bilingual newsletter, and I found that I had to increase the number of column inches for the Spanish text over the English text because it takes more words, apparently, in Spanish to say exactly the same thing that it does in English. Latin is even more compressed than English. If you were doing, I wouldn't do a joint Latin-English newsletter, but you go the other way. So again, the key thing is not the length, it is that one answers the questions thoroughly and systematically. I would say, as a rule of thumb, probably 1 to 2 pages. So if you're only writing a paragraph, not doing enough of a job. If you're writing 5 to 10 pages, you're verging on a term paper rather than an essay. This is an essay. So as Aristotle might tell us, strike the golden mean. Well, I hope this helps. And now your job is get to writing. I need some things to read, so please, I hope you will send me some good essays. Thank you.